It's symbolical, Joel, that this week, when we, according to the schedule of our seminar, according to the calendar of our seminar, are going to speak about the cross and bearing one's cross. In the Orthodox Church, it is devoted to the memory of the cross. So two calendars in this point coincided, the calendar of our seminar and the church calendar. Let's read the text. Do you see the text?
Да.
Okay. Тогда давайте прочтем стихи 34, 35. Антон Гунарович, вы с нами?
Да,
Давайте я вас попрошу тогда быть нашим чтецом.
хорошо. 34-35, да?
Да. 34, 30.
Kai proskalisamenos ton ochlon syntois matetais autu, eipen autois. Eitis thelei opisomu akaluthein aparnesastho euton kai arato ton stauron autu kai akaluthei tomoi. Gosgar ean thele ten psychen autu, sosai apalesei auten gosdan apolesei ten psychen autu eniken emukai tu evangeliu sosei auten.
Подозвав к себе народ вместе с учениками, он сказал им: кто хочет следовать за мною, пусть забудет о себе и идет за мною, взяв свой крест. Ну, какие проблемы-то у нас, как переводчиков, могут перед нами вставать? Оклус — это слово может иметь одновременно и нейтральные ассоциации, негативные, да? Это и народ, и толпа. Здесь, может быть, все-таки имеется в виду скорее какие-то нейтральные коннотации, что в данном случае, вот, когда эта вещь говорится, интересно, конечно, контраст с предшествующим текстом, да? Про мессианское достоинство Иисус говорит только ученикам и строго запрещает это распространять дальше, а вот это изречение, которое прошли сейчас, оно, согласно Евангелию от Марка, преподносится и народу, и ученикам всем вместе. Но вместе с учениками он сказал: кто хочет следовать за мною, описанному аклотейн, неожиданным образом, про это уже говорили, у нас это описанному перекликается с тем описанному юпаге, который перед этим Иисус говорит Петру или сатане в образе Петра. Перекличка слишком явная, чтобы ее игнорировать, но совершенно непонятно, что бы здесь она могла обозначать, да? Как бы все приглашают к тому, чтобы идти за Христом, и Петр, и ученики, и Офлус. Пусть забудет о себе, но отвергнется себе, да? Апарнасасто, вот он, и, взяв свой крест, за мною идет. One of the most intriguing points with regard to this verse is that here it looks as if we have on Jesus' lips the prediction of his own fate, of his own crucifixion. And the problem is whether we can relate it to historical Jesus, or whether we should understand this as saying that the church put on Jesus' lips after his crucifixion and the Easter events. What do you say about this, Joel?
Well, difficult question. I guess I think methodologically, we know that the church did put things on Jesus' lips that related to its situation. We can see that just by comparing Matthew and Luke to Mark. You know, there's expansions which sometimes relate to the church's situation. So I think methodologically one has to begin with the hypothesis that it reflects the church rather than Jesus. And then if one wants to argue that it goes back to Jesus, one has to make an argument for that. So that the default position is it reflects the church, because we know it was written by somebody in the church, you know, decades after Jesus. So in this case, can you push it back before the author of the gospel to some pre-existent tradition? And I guess I'm skeptical that you can in this case. It seems to correspond so closely to what actually happened. Now, I think some argue that the metaphor of taking up one's cross, you know, that could be used metaphorically. And I think there's some like later rabbinic sources that even use this phrase, you know, for just bearing one's burden. Those are later sources. I think what I'd feel more comfortable affirming is that Jesus called people to follow him, and no matter what the cost, because, you know, there's this crisis coming and you have to be on the right side of this coming conflict between God and the forces of evil. So I don't think one can prove that it's not from Jesus, but I don't think one can make a probable argument that it goes back to Jesus. It is interesting to me this, though, the phrase "etisteli opisso mu akaluthein,"
Mm-hmm.
that strikes me. I don't think that's it. That's, you know, it's not very smooth Greek. You know, one could just say moi akaluthein. I think that would be smoother Greek. So I think one might argue that there is, you know, some interference from Semitic syntax here. So, you know, that might be a part of an argument on the other side. But, you know, again, in writing my commentary, I generally didn't want to engage these questions of what goes back to the historical Jesus and what doesn't, because, you know, Mark is Mark. Mark is not the historical Jesus, and I think the way back to the historical Jesus is painful and difficult. And, you know, one could write like a whole dissertation on whether 834 goes back to the historical Jesus, and I didn't have time to do that.
Okay.
But what do you think? What's your opinion?
I read your commentary, and in your commentary, you draw our attention that you have a similar image in rabbinic sources, and especially in Genesis Rabbah. This is the text that you referred, Bereshit Rabbah, a midrash on Genesis, and a commentary on a commentary on the sacrifice of Isaac. Yes, as it is normal for the rabbinical commentary, they have at first the quotation from the biblical text. Руслана, вы не хотите там прочесть по-еврейски цитируемый кусочек? Вплоть до первую строчку. Вплоть до курсора. Нет? Прийти на сведения, это я прочту. Сам Вайках
Давайте я прочту.
Давайте, окей.
Вайках Авраам цейга эле.
Ола.
Ола. Это цейга ола.
Да. Авраам взял дерево, дрова для всесожжения, для Алла, и дальше дается, собственно, интерпретация Мидраша. Казашагу тоэн слово бихтефо. Как тот, кто несет, тоэн постбиблейский корень, вот крест свой на плече своем.
Yeah, it's interesting that the translator doesn't want to translate this as cross.
Sorry?
I said it's interesting that the English translator renders tzaluv as gibbet. You know, like I think a gibbet is like a gallows, you know, for hanging people. But you know, I mean, the word generally means a cross in, you know, early post-Christian contexts.
Yes, and even when referring to Christianity, we have the term Salbanut, as far as I remember, as the name for Christian faith in modern Hebrew. I think this is probably exactly in order not to provide any connotations with the Christian narrative.
Yeah, not to provide, ammunition for Christians. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, that's interesting in itself. You know, the translational choice made here reflects religious polemics also, I think.
Yes, exactly. But what is more important for us is not the religious polemics and the religious situation of the 20th century, or whenever this English translation was made, but rather the religious situation, the religious imagery of 2000 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting comparison, and of course, you know, one might make an argument that there is some Akedah symbolism in Mark, that Jesus is like Isaac, he's a beloved son. And so, for some passages in Mark, like the baptismal narrative, I think one can posit that maybe there is some of that symbolism, though, how developed it was in the first century is a big question. Did Judaism already have the idea that Isaac was a willing sacrifice, not just a passive sacrifice as he is in the Bible, but in later rabbinic texts and later, he willingly sacrifices himself. So, I mean, this is very interesting, but of course it's from 3 or 4 centuries after Gospel of Mark. So that's the problem.
Yes, you're right, but the Isaac typology, as you just mentioned, and as you state in your commentary, is quite obvious from the very beginning of the Gospel, starting from Mark 1:11. Yes, where God says, "Sui ohiosmu agapetos." We have this word agapetos, which clearly points back to the Genesis narrative, to the story of Akedah. Because even if the phrase "Sui ohiosmu" is a clear quotation from Psalm 2, but there is no agapetos in Psalm 2. So it was added by Mark, or by the tradition which was behind Mark. And if we understand that agapetos is a reference back to Akedah, then even the previous words, sui or hyosmu, also acquire another meaning.
Mhm.
God addresses Jesus, agapetos, his son, in the same way as Abraham addresses his beloved son, agapetos Isaac, before the crucifixion. So from this typological point of view, the Jesus cross is predicted already from this verse, Mark 1:11. But the
Yeah,
question is,
if one knows the Bible very, very well, and also the way the tradition has developed, after the Bible. So I think it is very interesting. It may very well be relevant, but the developed forms of the tradition are later. So that's the problem, which, I don't think it's always an unsurmountable problem, but it is a problem. The later date of like texts, like the Genesis Rabbah one that that I quoted and that you were comparing it to.
yes, but the similarity is too obvious. And of course, in the context of the interconfessional polemics, I think it would be very strange if we can ascribe this text from Genesis Rabbah to some sort of reminiscence of the gospel narrative.
Yeah.
So we should understand this either as a coincidence or as two independent witnesses that the imagery of Isaac, innocent victim, bringing his own cross to the place of execution in the context of temptation by Satan, developed independently. All this was some common background, both for Christian narrative and for the Bereshit Rabbah, even though Bereshit Rabbah is many centuries after the gospel narrative.
I agree that it's an intriguing parallel and should be noted and weighed. And I mean, I have similar feelings when, I read about the Lubavitcher Rebbe, this Hasidic rabbi who died in Brooklyn in the 1980s, and I've written about him and some of the parallels between people's belief in him as Messiah and Christian belief in Jesus as Messiah are astounding. Now, in that case, he lived like 20 centuries after the New Testament was written, and but still, this is a Hasidic Jewish community. It doesn't seem like people would be, picking up Christian ideas and ascribing them to their rabbi, but it's a possibility. So you have these parallels, and they either attest to, as you say, independent transmission of similar ideas, in this case for 20 centuries, or there's direct influence one way or the other. And it's, a similar methodological problem, though I think even greater because it's 20 centuries rather than 3 or 4, with modern communications and, books readily available. Whereas in the rabbinic period, what you're talking about is, mostly people transmitting traditions orally, most people being illiterate. Most of these traditions we know in the case of both I think we know in the case of most both early Christianity and the rabbinic tradition, most things were transmitted orally in the beginning. So I think you can make a stronger case for that maybe the sort of tradition that you have in Bereshit Rabbah pre-existed Christianity. And especially, I think there are some earlier witnesses to some similar Akedah ideas being developed beyond the biblical text. For example, and I remember there's some article by Robert Hayward on pseudo-Philo and his development of Akedah ideas. So if you can trace a trajectory, then I think there's a stronger case.
Okay, thank you. At the same time, your words about the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Melech HaMashiach, of course, also gives a sort of counter argument. I remember when I lived in Israel, I participated in discussion about modern Hasidisms, and especially this Messianic movement within Hasidism was heavily influenced by the ideas and topics of Christianity. Of course, whatever their religious background, they lived in the States where the culture is heavily permitted by Christian imagery and Christian ideas. So it's not so astonishing that some ideas of the followers of the Lubavitcher Rebbe were influenced by the Christian context.
Well,
It's a
yes,
good,
he was an educated person. He studied in Paris in the 20s and 30s, I think. He was well read. So, yeah, I think there is, as you say, there's a stronger counter argument for a direct influence of Christianity on some of his thinking. It is nevertheless very interesting, and one of the things I think is most interesting, so this is a digression, but definitely in his thought there was the idea that when the Messianic age comes, the Torah will change, and that's a really interesting idea. I think that's if that idea was around in Paul's time, it would help explain some of Paul's radical ideas about the Torah. But we don't get anything but a few little hints in rabbinic tradition, ancient rabbinic tradition, that the Torah will change when the Messiah comes. But we have that idea definitely there in the teaching of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And I suspect it must have been around in the first century also, but the evidence is very hard to find. I think W.D. Davies wrote, a small little book about Torah in the Messianic age, and he was really able to find very little Jewish evidence for that idea. But I still suspect it was around.
I published last year an article in Novum Testamentum on the nomos in the Septuagint and in the New Testament. I can share it with you.
Yeah, I'd like to see. It was on what?
It was mostly on the meaning of nomos in the
All right.
Septuagint, but I put special attention to Jeremiah passages which spoke about nomos in the context of the new covenant.
Yes, I'd like to see that. I think I
Okay.
heard about it from Carl, but I don't think I saw it.
Yes, I discussed it a lot with Carl.
Yeah.
I'll send it to you today.
Okay, thank you.
It's exactly on the same topic that you just mentioned.
Toda Rabbah.
Okay.
Now, notice that in this Bereshit Rabbah passage, they're not really interested in the Tziluv. They're more interested in the Ma'achelet, right? What sort of knife is this? Why is it called that?
Yes, it's an interesting question. Маша, я вижу, вы написали в чат небольшую заметку. Вы с нами? Про символику деревьев. Возможно, Маша, написав нам заметку про символику деревьев, на секунду отключилась нашей общей дискуссии. Давайте, может быть, вернемся потом к Машиному замечанию чуть позже. Even if there was a symbolism of carrying one's cross in the Judaism of Jesus' time, and even if this particular verse was already on the background of Isaac symbolism, we still cannot be sure whether this Isaac symbolism for Jesus was already on Jesus' own lips or was just put there by the early church. Because we know that, in fact, the whole narrative of Jesus' crucifixion in Mark is mostly made up from allusions scattered throughout the Psalter.
Yes,
So-
I agree. And but also, you know, just as a thought experiment, I mean, say if Jesus had said something like 8:34, that wouldn't necessarily mean that he was predicting his own crucifixion, right? I mean, he might be using it in the same way that the Bereshit Rabbah passage is using the image, just to say, look, if you want to follow me, you will have tribulations. You may be persecuted. You may have to take up your cross in the same way that Christians today talk, at least in America. You know, people say, you know, like, my son is my cross to bear. You know, you can use this image and not mean it literally. I mean, he's not saying that I am going to be crucified. He's saying that you will symbolically participate in crucifixion if you follow me.
Yes, but the Isaac symbolism that you just discussed
Yeah.
makes it more probable that whether Jesus or early church authored this text, it was authored already with the new Isaac in mind, not just with the followers of the new Isaac in mind.
Yeah. I yeah, I think that's an intriguing possibility. I think I'm not totally persuaded that it's probable. But maybe we're just fighting about words now.
Okay. 35. Кто хочет спасти свою жизнь, тот потеряет ее. А кто потеряет свою жизнь ради меня и Евангелия, вести, тот спасет ее. Ну, с точки зрения перевода, если опять же перед нами стоит вопрос о том, как нам переводить слово Евангелие, да? Очевидно, что использование слова Евангелие здесь у нас означало бы, что вот уже на устах Иисуса оказывается не просто пророчество о распятии, но указание на книжку под названием Евангелие, которая когда-то будет написана. Это сюда не подходит. Может быть, вот разные варианты. Благая весть, радостная весть или просто весть с большой буквы подчеркивает то новое, что в проповеди Иисуса содержится. Опять же, с точки зрения и перевода, и с точки зрения понимания фона, семитского фона, высказанные здесь у нас вопрос это просто, как нам переводить слово псюхе, душа, да? Греческий перевод еврейского нефеш, безусловно, был единственным осмысленным вариантом который был в распоряжении переводчиков Септуагинты, вот действительно, нефеш еврейской Библии – это та сущность, которая обеспечивает существование и осмысленную деятельность человеческого тела. Вот. Но между еврейским нефеш, по крайней мере, как это видно из библейских текстов, и греческим псюхе, по крайней мере, к тому моменту, когда перевод был осуществлен, была, конечно же, уже колоссальная разница, что греческое псюхе, как мы это можем видеть из произведений Платона, и не только, вполне могла после смерти человека существовать отдельно от него, в то время как в Библии мы, в еврейской Библии, в Ветхом Завете нигде не видим, чтобы нефеш могла бы существовать после смерти человека отдельно от него. Да? Поэтому вот здесь, где у нас за псюхе, по-видимому, становится такой семитский контекст, да, скорее жизненная сила, возможно, что перевод словом «душа» был бы скорее не очень удачный. Хотя, кажется, именно такой перевод этому месту и прилагается в ряде переводов, включая синодальный. I spoke about how to translate psyche in this context. Translate as soul or to translate as life.
Yeah, and I think in my commentary I talk about if you take it as life, you know, the basic idea could the basic, you know, sort of original idea, and this is before Jesus. I think I had some parallels from Greco-Roman literature. Well, people were saying in military contexts that you know, if you want to survive in a war, you sometimes it's a mistake to try to save your life. Like if you run away, you know, you'll be shot in the back, stuff like that. And so sometimes just even in a realistic military sense, the best way to save your life is, you know, to face the enemy resolutely and be willing to lose your life. And I think if that was sort of a proverb that was around in the atmosphere, what this would represent is kind of an eschatological transposition of that idea. That, you know, taking this piece of proverbial and even prudential just advice, wisdom, and eschatologizing it. That if you want to save your life in this age, you may lose it in the next age. You know, so the way to save your life is to be willing to lose it. So it's and I think you find this elsewhere in the teaching of Jesus, traditional wisdom that has been eschatologized either by Jesus himself or by some Jewish apocalyptic predecessor.
Okay. Meanwhile, I looked at different translations, and at least I couldn't find any translation except Russian synodal translation, the Russian Synodal translation, where psyche is translated as soul and not as life. Even King James Version, which was very influential for the translators of the Russian Synodal version, also has life.
Why do you think the synodal translators translated as dushu?
I think they just wanted to keep the text closer to the Church Slavonic, the official text of the Church, because, of course, this is one of the most important places in the Gospel, and since the Russian Synodal version was originally intended only for private reading, where the Church Slavonic text is to be read publicly in the church, they didn't want to create too much distance between the two versions. But of course, they created, take into account the Russian meaning of the word dusha, and the Russian meaning of expressions like спасти душу, save one's soul. The meaning that is, at least this text may be read in Russian in the meaning that is completely different from whatever historical Jesus or Mark or even the Byzantine Church understood with these words. One who wants to save his soul, namely to live a life according to religious norms, will lose it. This is definitely not the interpretation of the gospel, but at least a couple of times in our Russian context, I met people who read this text without biblical and Hebrew background in mind, who understood this text in this meaning.
Yeah, I think there's a Q text that's related that speaks of, it says, don't be afraid of those who can destroy the body, but fear him who can destroy both body and soul in hell. And so I think, in that text, there's more of a pressure towards a body-soul dualism.
Yes,
than there
exactly.
is in this one. So I don't think, that the Slavonic translation and the synodal translation, they're not totally out of biblical context, because in some passages, even in the Gospels, you do get a body-soul dualism implied. Though I agree that, Jizen or something would be a better translation here.
Yes. Wait a second. I just wanted to put these synoptic parallels.
Yeah. Synopsis.
Of course, especially if we think that these words may go back to historical Jesus, it would be interesting to compare Mark version with the Q version, and also with what other other Gospels made with the Markan material. In Mark, see here, post on apelles ten psychen autu aheneken emu kaitu Evangelium. And in Matthew, apelles ten psychen autu aheneken emu. Matthew drops the Evangelium. How can we explain this? Or Markan version here is secondary.
Um,
Of course, весть, благая весть, Evangelion is very important for Mark from the very first line of his gospel.
yeah, I mean, I think it's important for Matthew also.
Yeah, but he drops it.
Right. Isn't this a doublet though? I think he has. Hold on a second.
By the way, do you see the synopsis now on the screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, no, you're okay. You're right about he does drop it in Matthew 16. Verse 35, which isn't what, which is, yeah, you have a different passage on the page here because there's different parallels.
Yes, some parallel passages go back to Q,
Yeah,
and some parallel passages are probably borrowed by Matthew from Mark, but I think here this is the passage borrowed by Matthew from Mark, where
right,
he
yeah,
drops to Evangelium.
yeah. I don't know how would explain that. I mean, I think probably the to Evangelio was in his source. Though the reference to Evangelio makes it more obviously a Christian saying.
One suggestion, of course, very speculative, would be that this saying somehow existed independently of Mark,
Yeah.
and Matthew just followed, though taking the main bulk of the text from Mark, he still changed it to accommodate it to another form that was independent of Mark.
That's possible. I happen to have Dale Allison's commentary on Matthew here. Let me see what he
Okay.
says. Because he notices everything. I'm looking for it. Go on, and I'll come back to me. Yeah.
Окей. Пока мы сейчас пытаемся разгадать, почему в Евангелии от Матфея в параллельном месте, при том, что, в общем-то, правдоподобнее всего, что параллельное место Евангелия от Матфея было основано на этом месте из Марка, но отсутствует ссылка на Евангелие. И Джоэль сейчас смотрит некоторые комментарии к Матфею. Есть ли у нас по отношению к этим двум стихам еще какие-то замечания или вопросы?
Let's see. For the gospel has fallen away. Well, all he said, he says it's a question. Dale Ellison says, did Matthew think on account of me and on account of the gospel were synonymous? So that Matthew may have thought it was redundant to say on account of me and on account of the gospel.
This doesn't look very persuasive.
Well, that's why he posed it as a question, not as an assertion. That's what I do when I'm not sure about something. I say, could it be that? And then you can say yes or no. I'm going to go get Uli Lutz and see what he says.
Маш, похоже, что мы с Джоэлем здесь столкнулись с проблемой, для решения которой Джоэль сейчас будет перебирать многочисленные комментарии к Евангелию от Матфея из своей библиотеки. И пока Джоэль пошел за очередным комментарием, я бы хотела спросить, вы в нашем чате написали про символизм деревьев в христианской интерпретации этих текстов?
Ну, да, я мидраш из раввинистический, что это такая популярная вещь, и, ну, собственно, какая-то такая у меня была мысль, что, может быть, поскольку это что-то такое очень частотное в ранней христианской литературе, вообще христианской литературе, не могло ли это как-то повлиять на иудейскую традицию, между ними есть какие разные пересечения разного рода. Вот, ну, да, это не какая-то додуманная мысль, просто действительно это очень частотная вещь в христианской литературе, поэтому мне показалось, что это как-то релевантно.
Хорошо.
Ну вот, ну, может быть, еще можно вспомнить, в Эсфире есть дерево,
На
да,
котором Амана повесили?
вот, и которое в Септуагинте переводится через глагол стауро.
И проблема в том, что, безусловно, этот тип казни был вполне распространен на Древнем Ближнем Востоке, хорошо знаком зрителям, но, кажется, у нас действительно раньше Евангелия, а в еврейской традиции раньше вот того кусочка из Берешит Раба, который мы сейчас разбирали, нету свидетельств того, чтобы вот этот жуткий образ как-то соотносился бы с положительными персонажами, как в случае с жертвоприношением Исаака, или здесь вот с образом Христа, потому что Аман никак не может восприниматься как положительный персонаж.
Безусловно. А можете показать еще раз это параллельное место из Матфея, про которое
Параллельное
речь
место
идет?
Матфея? Окей.
You know, the other, so this is a doublet, right? There's also in Matthew 10, yeah. That also, I mean, I think that supports what you were arguing, that maybe the original form of the saying doesn't have any reference to the Evangelion, and that Mark has added it. Because Matthew obviously knows another form of this saying, of the same saying, from Q, and again, it lacks a reference to the gospel. And
Okay.
I think also the Lucan form of that saying in Mark 10 also lacks
Yes.
it.
And the second doublet in one is Matthew 10:37. That's what we looked at. And the second from Q is Matthew
16:25. That's the more
16.
direct. 16:25. That's the real parallel to Mark 8. I mean, it's the one that is at that point in Matthew's gospel.
Okay, so we can suppose that before Matthew there was, on the one hand, the Q version with Henneken and Emu, and the Markan version with Henneken and Emu kai to Evangeliu, and that
He prefers the Q version.
yes, and that he
Some
prefers Q version even when retelling the Markan material.
Right.
Okay.
But you could make the argument, it's more speculative, but you could also make the argument that maybe his edition of Mark didn't have the reference to Evangeliu also. But I think that would be less likely than that he has this other version, but one still has to ask why, if he has these two versions, the Markan version and the Q version, why does he prefer the Q version? So you've got the same redactional question really.
Okay. Let's move on. But before we move on, I would like to ask our Russian colleagues. Мы сейчас разбирали в течение некоторого времени сопоставление Евангелия от Марка в этом месте с Евангелием от Матфея. Скажите, нужно ли нам какое-то по этому поводу русское summary? Или все было достаточно ясно и понятно? Окей, если русское summary нам не очень нужно, то тогда давайте перейдем к следующему стиху. Антон Гуннарович, вы как наш чтец еще 36-й стих нам не прочтете?
Да, сейчас. Тигар Опхелей, Антропон, Ирдесей, Τον κόσμον όλον καί δημιουργέναι την ψυχήν αυτού.
Да. Что пользы человеку, если он приобрел весь мир, а жизнь свою загубил? Ну, давайте 37-й еще стих тоже прочтем по-гречески, по-русски.
Higardoi anthropos antallagma tes psyches autu.
Какой выкуп предложен он тогда за свою жизнь? Ну, давайте 38-й стих еще тоже прочтем, потом, можете, попросим Джоэля, какие там здесь приложить комментарии. 38-й стих тогда.
Os gar ean epaschiunthe mecaitus emus logos ente genea taute te moichalidi kai emartolo kai hoiuios tu anthropo epaschiuntesetai auton rotan elthe ente doxe tu patros autu meta ton angelon ton agion.
Да, кто постыдится меня и моих слов перед этим неверным и грешным поколением, того постыдится и Сын Человеческий, когда придет во славе Отца Своего со святыми ангелами. Вот здесь, в общем, может быть, что вот это представление о поколении, да, Рагина мой халис, да, Кайха Марталос, вот этот род прелюбодейный и грешный, как сказано в финальном переводе, содержит в себе какую-то отсылку к истории Ноя. Да? Ной был единственным, по-моему, праведником в роде своем, в своем поколении. И дальше мы знаем, что контекст Ноева потопа описывается как раз вот теми какими-то словами и образами, которые, может быть, обосновывают выбор здесь соответствующих греческих слов, когда речь идет про Иисуса. Вот в свое время, когда я вот готовил этот русский перевод, который сейчас здесь вывожу на экран, я решил перевести мехалис более общим словом, неверным и грешным. Но, может быть, вот для этой переклички с образом нового поколения даже синодальный перевод, сказать, блудное, прелюбодейное поколение было бы лучше. Не знаю. We spoke now, Joel, about the image of this generation and about the possible Old Testament background of this generation as referring back to the generation of Noah. Just the symbolism of Jesus and the church as a repetition of what happened in the days of Noah.
Yeah, I think that's very likely, and especially since in Second Temple Judaism, the generation of Noah, was often mentioned as a wicked generation and as a foreshadowing of the generation of the end. of the wicked people who will be destroyed by God when he comes at the end. I think you have that in places like First Enoch and other Second Temple Jewish texts. I was wondering, does Nieviernim, does that have the sexual connotation of moichalide?
That's exactly what where I looked at my own translation and asked myself whether this translation should be changed, because of course Michalis has connotations with being not faithful, but of course with a special connotation of being not faithful in sexual relationships. And probably this this context, this background of the generation of Noah should rather point to stressing these overtones in the translation, because at least in the canonical text of Genesis that we have before us, the most obvious, the most immediate reason for the flood was the fact that there was some illicit sex between sons of gods and daughters of men.
Well, yeah, and I'd also think of, the image of faithless Israel in Ezekiel and, some other, and Hosea. So I think there's, I think when, the term, so I think most English translations render this as adulterous. And I think probably that's important to retain.
Yes, of course, this image of relationship between God and Israel, like a marriage where Israel's sins are interpreted as being not faithful in marriage. Yes.
I think I mentioned, I think I mentioned before, there is a very good short, maybe rewritten dissertation, but it started out as a dissertation about this phrase, this generation, by some Scandinavian, Lindeskog, I think was his name. And I found it very useful for passages like this.
Yes, as concerns the typology of Noah, of course, we have important passages in queue. Now I have Matthew on my screen. Do you see Matthew?
Yes.
Yes. Hospergan gar hamere to know hutas este heperusia to hiu to anthropo. So the image of Son of Man, parousia, is connected with the image of the days of Noah. And the parallel Q passage in Luke 17. So this makes it very likely, I would like even to say probably even certain, that here in our passage in Mark that we're looking at, we also have the idea, the image of Son of Man, and the image of parousia, the reference to Regenia, the generation of Noah, is also quite certain. Тогда мой вопрос к нашим русскоязычным участникам. Я вот сам это дело выделил, и совершенно справедливо меня еще и Джоэль сейчас покритиковал за то, что здесь у меня потерялись сексуальные обертона, присутствующие в греческом «мойхалис», который и в синодальном переводе тоже есть. Какое русское слово нам здесь лучше поставить? Что скажете, русскоязычные братья? Синодальное прелюбодейный? Или что? Или как?
Ну, блудный есть еще.
Да. Вот как раз я задумался, что же нам здесь тогда написать в качестве перевода греческого «мойхалис»? Прелюбодейный или блудный? Потому что если речь идет про метафору Израиля как неверной жены Бога, то тогда, конечно, лучше с точки зрения семантики русских слов, лучше прелюбодейный, если речь идет про отсылку к временам Ноя, вот тем самым illicit relationship между божественными существами и дочерями человеческими, тогда скорее должно быть не поколение не прелюбодейное, а блудное. Что нам здесь лучше?
Может быть, развращенная?
Вот, может быть, развратная.
Развратное, да? Да, разврат, она, конечно, хорошо покрывает как идею, как образ незаконного сочетания небожителей с земными женщинами, так и образ измены Израиля. Да, хорошо. Спасибо большое.
А если распутная?
Развратное или распутное?
Развратное сильнее, сильнее развратное.
Развратного шире значение просто, поэтому лучше.
Хорошо. Давайте. Спасибо большое. Вот. Да, по ходу дела, мне кажется, сильно мы улучшили этот текст за счет его ассоциации с важнейшими ветхозаветными образами. Окей. А кто постыдится меня и моих слов перед этим развратным и грешным поколением, того постыдится
Спасибо.
Дарья. Того постыдится и Сын Человеческий, когда придет во славе Отца Своего со святыми ангелами. Of course, an interesting question that we have here is, once again, what is the reference of the Son of Man here? Because earlier, even if we take all this as an eyewitness report of Jesus' words, even in this context, earlier text when Jesus talks about himself as the Son of Man is probably presented in such a way that only the disciples who knew the messianic secret would understand that the Son of Man in verse 31 is Jesus.
Yeah, he's only talking to the disciples at this point, right? This is
Yes, you
the
remember.
messianic spirit is maintained.
Yes, you remember we had some discussion about what parousia
Yeah,
may mean here, and as far as I remember, we both agreed that most probably this parousia meant not publicly, but rather openly before the disciples.
right. And it's only in verse 34 that you get an explicit mention of the ochlos.
Yes. So the earlier discussions there between Jesus, Peter, and disciples, and only here ochlos appears. So even if we accept that everything narrated here is historically true, and this was said by Jesus to the ochlos and the disciples, we should inevitably understand that, at least in this context, talking to the ochlos, Jesus made a distinction between himself and the Son of Man.
Well, at least that's a possibility. That what he says is open to, it's ambiguous, and it could be interpreted as him talking about himself, but it could be interpreted as him talking about another figure. And as I said, I think in my little presentation, 838 was really, Bultmann's premier example for his assertion that Jesus didn't consider himself the Son of Man. Even though even though what you do see is that Jesus is making a strong connection between himself and people's reactions to himself and his words, and how the Son of Man will treat them. But he also seems to be, or at least you could easily interpret him as distinguishing himself from that figure. If you react to me in a certain way, the Son of Man will react to you in a similar way, and vice versa.
Okay.
But I wonder if Mark himself would be aware of that problem or that possibility. I don't know.
Ну что же, вот сегодня на неделю крестопоклонную мы с вами как раз прочитали этот центральный текст для евангельского нарратива, для будущей христианской традиции. Мы подошли, по сути дела, к сцене преображения, но, наверное, преображение мы сегодня уже не будем с вами затрагивать. Будем про преображение говорить в следующий четверг. По сегодняшнему кусочку еще какие-нибудь замечания, будь то экзегетические, переводческие, исторические. Есть у кого-нибудь из нас?
One other thing, can I just put in here? So 938 or 838, it is very reminiscent of Daniel 7. But in Daniel 7, the one like a son of man comes up to heaven and is seated next to and on a throne next to the Ancient of Days. So his coming is up in Daniel 7, whereas here and in a lot of and also in chapter 13, there's also a coming of the Son of Man, but he's coming down really from heaven with divine glory to earth. So the direction of movement is the opposite. So he's obviously invoking Daniel 7, using Daniel 7, but also altering it in line with the Christian belief in the second coming.
Yes, but that's the same logic that we have in John, that no one came up to heaven except the Son of Man who came down from heaven. So it's obviously a part of the image of the Son of Heaven, at least at this epoch, that he's going up and down, communicating between heaven and earth.
Well, I'd say at least in Christian contexts.
At least in Christian context.
That's right. I mean, I don't think, and again, the point of comparison would be First Enoch, if that is pre-Christian. But in First Enoch, as I recall, the Son of Man is in heaven, and at the end, his people will be with him, and I think there may be an implication that he will come down to earth, though I can't remember. But I don't remember anything in First Enoch about the Son of Man going up to heaven. And I would think that idea is Christian.
You mean going down from heaven?
No, I think the idea of, well, I think they're both Christian ideas. I mean, Jesus has to get to heaven. He dies, and so he goes to heaven, and then he'll return from heaven. And so they use Daniel 7 to talk about both of those things.
Okay.
But yeah, but do we have in pre-Christian Judaism, do we have in First Enoch the idea of the Son of Man coming down from heaven? I think we do, but I can't remember specific passages. But yeah, but in Daniel, he comes up to the throne room of God, and there he's enthroned with God. That's what basically happens.
Okay, thank you. Отец Ириней, я видел, вы поднимали руку.
Да, спасибо большое. Хотел уточнить, может быть, я ошибаюсь, но мне показалось, у вас в каких-то местах «сын человеческий», оба слова с большой буквы пишутся, в других человеческий с маленькой буквы. Вы здесь вводите какое-то различие в терминологии? Это...
Нет.
Ага, это просто в контексте того, что мы сейчас говорим, что Иисус говорит про себя, и что говорят о нем, или в третьем лице разговора о Сыне Человеческом.
Нет, здесь совершенно очевидно, что независимо от того, какова была бы сложная история этого выражения, здесь вот в Евангелии никаких противопоставлений между разными образами нет. То есть противопоставление между тем, что, где, как говорится, народу, ученикам и прочее, но, конечно же, если писать, то орфографически нужно писать одно и то же.
То есть
это чисто...
оба слова с большой буквы, я правильно понимаю?
Я думаю, да, да.
А если мы чуть-чуть выше поднимемся, мне кажется, это чуть-чуть выше по тексту, и мне кажется, заметил, там слово «человеческий» было с маленькой буквы в этом словосочетании. По тексту
это нужно будет поправить, это чисто такая корректорская вещь, которую обязательно делаю.
Ага, все, ну чуть выше, мне кажется, где-то тут было.
Даже не важно.
Я понял, это вопрос чисто корректорский. Все понял, спасибо большое, спасибо, благодарю.
31 человеческой с маленькой.
Окей. Хорошо.
31 стих, он прямо на экране сейчас, да, 31 стих.
Да, точно. Хорошо, друзья. Тогда Спасибо большое всем, кто с нами был сегодня. И до встречи next Thursday.
Спасибо.
До свидания.
До
Спасибо.
свидания,
До
спасибо.
скорого.
До свидания.
До свидания.
До свидания.
Да, спасибо.
До свидания. Спасибо.